This is Greg Strange with the latest of our business vidcast from the Institute of Directors. And with me today is the Chief Economist of the IoD, Graeme Leach. Graeme, we go into 2008 in roughly the same way as we left 2007, with plenty of uncertainty on the national and indeed the global economic plane. What is the problem?
The problem is that we've got more uncertainty than we've had probably for 15 years at the global level and certainly at the UK level. There was considerable uncertainty already because the economy was moving towards a turning point as a result of the interest rate rises the Bank of England had introduced over the 2006-7 period. And then on top of that, we've had a double shock. We've had a shock from the energy price effects of higher oil prices, higher energy and utility prices as well. And at the same time, we've had the problems compounded by the impact of the credit crunch, which obviously landed last autumn. And so the economy was already at a turning point, which is a difficult time to forecast. And then the difficulties have been compounded by these two shocks, which have landed and really made the task difficult for the Bank of England. Why have they done that? Quite simply because the bank doesn't know really, it's not quite sure whether it should be more concerned about the growth outlook or the inflation outlook. Clearly it has an inflation target and that's its primary responsibility, but growth impacts on inflation. And it's not quite sure at the moment which is the bigger problem at present. The credit crunch suggests that companies, households are going to have to pay more for borrowing. They may even have physical restrictions on the borrowing because banks have had their capital bases eroded. So that suggests that business investment, household consumer spending could be slower. That clearly impacts on demand. But at the same time, higher energy prices feed through into higher prices in the high street as well. And so these two factors, one saying, do we look forward and worry more about the growth outlook and what's going to happen to the UK economy? But in doing that, can we be safe, or do we still need to be looking over our shoulder at the inflationary pressure? Means it's very, very difficult. So pray for a bit of wisdom for the MPC. They're going to need it this year.
Now, times like this, when there is so much uncertainty about, people turn to chief economists and other wise men and women, convinced that you alone perhaps have the answer. Is there an answer to the current UK problems?
Well, there's a possible answer that you could run with and say this is definitely what's going to happen, and if you get it right, well, you're going to look pretty darn good at the end of this year. But the reality is there is so much uncertainty that we can't be sure. We would say that, and certainly the IoD in its economic forecast for 2008 has said that the odds still favour what we call a sort of muddle through scenario. We've coined the phrase stickyflation. Stickyflation is a situation whereby GDP growth this year slows considerably, probably slowing from over 3% in 2007 to around 1.7% this year. So growth nearly halves, but inflation is sticky in a downward direction. It's a bit resistant. It doesn't want to fall as much as what the Bank of England would like, because then it could reduce interest rates in response. Because inflation is sticky, the Bank of England can't reduce interest rates as much as they'd like, and so the overall result is that growth is much weaker. Now, that's not to say that interest rates won't fall. That's not to say that inflationary pressures won't ease either. We think they will over the course of 2008, but certainly in the first half of 2008, especially in the early months, we could see well above target inflation here. And as a result, the Bank of England's got to be very, very careful about reducing interest rates because it doesn't want to let the inflation genie out of the bottle. It's got to be mindful of that threat there. But at the same time, it doesn't want to be so mindful of the inflation threat that the economy tanks downwards far worse. So it's a difficult balancing act. I think they can pull it off. I think interest rates can be still reduced. I think overall, probably we're looking at 5% interest rates by the end of this year. So yes, we're looking for a further 2/4 point reductions, but it's not going to be the same as in the US. The US is in a different economic situation, much weaker situation. They may have already entered recession there. So the Bank of England is going to be sort of chastised as a bit of a Scrooge this year. Why can't you be generous like the US Federal Reserve and reduce interest rates in the way they are? Well, they're reducing in the manner they are because they've got much deeper problems than we have. And so the stickyflation scenario, which hopefully will enter the economic lexicon this year now, and will I think be the story of 2008. Much weaker growth, but resistant inflation. But there are alternatives as well, which we've got to acknowledge. There is an alternative of what we call stagflation, which is that inflationary pressures become actually much more intense at the same time that inflation maybe ratchets to 2% or more at the same time that growth slows. But I don't think that's likely. I think we can contain inflationary pressure. So we're not talking about the stagflation of the 1970s where you had much weaker growth and much higher inflation. That's a world away from now. There's an alternative scenario as well of much worse, which is deflation, where we have much weaker growth and the economy weakens and the global economy weakens to the point where actually we end up in a sort of quasi-Japan in the 1990s situation. I think we can avoid that as well. I think because inflationary pressures are not out of control, they're just a little bit above target. That means the Bank of England could always reduce interest rates if the economic outlook deteriorated more than we anticipate. So I think we can rule out the stagflation pretty simply. We can rule out the deflation with some confidence, but no absolute certainty. There's also probably the possibility of some sort of bounce back, that actually we've over-egged the credit crunch. The media, everybody's talked themselves into a situation which is actually, in media terms, much worse than the reality on the ground. The reality with our members, the reality with companies and households. They can cope with this situation a lot better than we are maybe envisaging, and therefore there is a risk that the Bank of England makes a policy mistake. It reduces interest rates actually just when the economy doesn't need it, and we get a little bit of a bounce back in the first half of this year. I don't think that's going to happen either, so I think we can probably park that one. So I think stickyflation is the story for 2008, but as we started off, considerable uncertainty. Watch for these other scenarios possibly unfolding, but I'd still put my money on stickyflation for 08.